The high desert of West Texas stretches out in every direction, a vast expanse of creosote and mesquite, broken only by the distant humps of the Davis Mountains. Here, where the land meets the sky in a razor-sharp horizon, the air itself seems to shimmer with possibility. This is a country that holds its secrets close, where the wind carries stories across 100-mile vistas, and the darkness between stars feels deep enough to fall into. For more than a century, travelers along Highway 67 have pulled over at a lonely roadside viewing station, their headlights cutting through the desert night, searching for something that defies explanation. The Marfa Lights have been documented since at least 1883, when a young cowboy named Robert Reed Ellison first reported strange illuminations dancing across the Mitchell Flat. What he saw that night, and what thousands have witnessed since, remains unexplained despite decades of investigation, scientific study, and skeptical inquiry. The lights appear as glowing orbs that move independently across the desert floor, sometimes merging, sometimes splitting apart, always seeming to possess an intelligence that natural phenomena shouldn't have. They've been described as white, yellow, orange, red, and blue. They hover, they dart, they pulse with an inner radiance that cameras struggle to capture and witnesses struggle to forget. Cowboys riding the range in the 1800s spoke of them in hushed tones around campfires, calling them skylights or spirit fires. They told stories of following the lights for miles, only to have them vanish like morning dew, or watching them perform aerial maneuvers that no bird or balloon could replicate. Ranch hands claimed the lights would appear during cattle drives, spooking entire herds and sending experienced cowhands reaching for their rifles even though there was nothing solid to shoot at. Lawmen patrolling the border country witnessed them hovering in perfect formations, moving with military precision, yet answering to no earthly command. Some said the lights were the lanterns of dead prospectors still searching for silver in the darkness. Others whispered that they were something far older and stranger, something that had been here long before men brought cattle and their fences to this unforgiving land. The Apache knew about the lights, though they kept their knowledge close. The few stories that filtered out spoke of places where the barrier between worlds grew thin, of warnings not to approach the dancing flames that move with purpose through the night. Mexican vaqueros crossed themselves when the lights appeared on the horizon, muttering prayers their grandfathers had taught them. The lights didn't care about the borders or beliefs. They appeared for everyone, democratic in their mystery, indifferent to those who witnessed them, whether cowboy or cattle baron, outlaw or lawman, gambler or gunfighter. In the years since the Ellison's first sighting, theories have multiplied like jackrabbits in the springs. Scientists have proposed everything from atmospheric reflections to piezoelectric discharges from quartz-bearing rocks stressed by tectonic shifts. Skeptics point to car headlights on distant highways, though the lights were seen for decades before automobiles existed in West Texas, witnessed by men on horseback who'd never seen a motor vehicle. Believers suggest everything from UFOs to dimensional portals to ball lighting with a mind of its own. The truth is, nobody knows. The Marfa Lights remain one of America's most persistent and well-documented unexplained phenomena, witnessed by ranchers and tourists, Texas Rangers and deputy marshals, scientists and dreamers, legends and outlaws. What makes Marfa Lights different from the other mysterious lights reported around the world is their consistency in their witnesses. They appear regularly enough that the town erected an official viewing area where visitors gather in darkness, hoping for a glimpse. They've been photographed, filmed, studied with sophisticated equipment, and chased across the desert by men brave enough or foolish enough to try. They remain as mysterious today as they were when Robert Ellison first spotted them from horseback in the starlight of 1883. The desert keeps its secrets, and the lights continue their nightly dance. The stories that follow span more than a century of West Texas history, from 1874 to 1954, from the final days of the open frontier to the modern era of automobiles and paved highways. They feature men who helped build the American West: Charles Goodnight, the legendary cattleman who pioneered trails through hostile territory, John Wesley Hardin, the most dangerous outlaw Texas ever produced, and Doc Holliday, the consumptive gambler and gunfighter whose name became synonymous with frontier violence. Alongside these famous names are the ordinary men who witnessed the extraordinary: a young cowboy on his first cattle drive, a deputy marshal patrolling the Mexican border, a Texas Ranger chasing bootleggers during the Depression, a surveyor mapping empty land, a prospector seeking silver in played-out veins, a soldier returning home from war. These are encounters with the unknown, moments when practical men confronted something that violated every rule they understood about how the world worked. Each witness responded according to his nature. Some approached the lights with curiosity, others with fear, still others with stoic acceptance of men who'd seen enough of the frontier to know that some mysteries won't yield to bullets or bravado. None of them could explain what they'd seen. None of them forgot. These are campfire tales for modern times, stories meant to be experienced in the quiet hours when the boundary between sleep and waking grows thin. Each narrative is independent, a complete encounter with the unexplained, but together they paint a picture of a phenomena that has captivated the American West for generations. They honor the mystery rather than attempting to solve it, respecting both the witnesses and the strange lights they saw hovering over the desert. As you settle in to listen, imagine yourself under the vast West Texas sky, where the lights blaze with brilliance city dwellers have forgotten, and the darkness between them seems to pulse with hidden life. The desert wind carries the scent of sage and creosote, and somewhere out on the Mitchell Flat, the lights are beginning their nightly dance. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some are meant to be witnessed, remembered, and passed along like stories around a dying fire. The Marfa Lights continue to appear, indifferent to our theories and our technology, our beliefs or our skepticism. They simply are as much a part of the American West landscape as the mountains in the sky. And on certain nights, when the conditions are just right and the desert holds its breath, they still call to something deep in the human spirit, that part of us that remembers when the world was full of wonder, when every shadow might hide magic, and when men on horseback could still encounter things that made them question everything they thought they knew. Welcome to Dark Sky Dossier. These are the stories the desert tells when UFOs spread across vast dark skies, when legends and outlaws and ordinary men stood face to face with the impossible, and when the only certainty was that some things would remain forever unexplained. If you enjoy these tales and want to support stories like them, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us bring more mystery, more history, and more wonder to listeners who, like you, appreciate the strange and beautiful things that happen when the stars come out over West Texas. Now settle in, close your eyes, and let the desert speak. Chapter 1. The Ellison Account. Robert Reed Ellison was 19 years old the first time he saw the lights, though he'd remember that night for the rest of his long life with a clarity that time couldn't dim. It was late spring of 1883 when he was driving a small herd of cattle north toward the railhead at Fort Worth, working for wages and experience under a trail boss named Cyrus Whitehall. They'd made camp on Mitchell Flat, a stretch of desert so level and featureless it seemed like the earth itself had given up trying. The cattle were settled, the watch was set, and Ellison had went to sleep first, which meant he could bed down right after supper and get a solid 4 hours before his turn as night guard. He'd just finished his coffee and was shaking out his bedroll when something caught his eye out toward the southern horizon. At first he thought it was another campfire, maybe bandits or another cattle outfit making the same long haul north. But the light was wrong somehow, too bright, too concentrated, and it seemed to hover for a few feet off the ground rather than flickering up from a proper fire. Ellison stood there with his blanket in his hands, watching the light pulse and shimmer like something alive. It was yellow and white, about the size of a lantern flame, but steadier. As he watched, it began to move laterally across his field of vision, traveling from east to west at a slow pace. "You see that?" he called out to Whitehall, who was smoking his pipe by the frontier wagon. The trail boss looked up, followed Ellison's pointing finger, and went very still. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They just watched as the light drifted across the darkness, like a firefly the size of a horse. Then, without warning, it split into two distinct orbs, each maintaining the same steady glow. The twin lights separated, one continuing west, with the other reversed course and heading back east. And damned if they didn't seem to be moving with purpose, like riders on patrol rather than any natural phenomenon Ellison had ever encountered. The other men in camp had noticed by now, and the conversation died away as everyone turned to watch the lights. They were 8 cowhands in all, most of them experienced range riders who spent years under the stars, and not one of them could offer an explanation that satisfied. Old Pete Holloway, who claimed to have ridden with John Chisholm himself, suggested it might be Mexican bandits signaling each other, but the lights were too bright and too distant for that to make sense. Someone else proposed will-o'-wisp, those ghost lights that supposedly appeared over marshland, but there wasn't enough water in 100 miles to support such a thing. The lights continued their strange dance for nearly an hour, sometimes merging back into a single orb, sometimes splitting into 3 or 4 smaller points of illumination. They moved with an eerie intelligence, seeming to trace patterns across the desert floor that suggested purpose without revealing intent. Ellison tried to judge the distance and concluded they were at least a mile out, maybe 2, which meant they had to be substantially larger than they appeared. No lantern could throw that much light, and no fire would move like that unless it was being carried. But there were no visible figures, no horses, nothing but the lights themselves floating through the darkness. Around 11 o'clock, Whitehall made a decision that would stick in Ellison's memory forever. "Saddle up," he told Ellison and 2 other young riders. "We're going to see what the hell those things are." They mounted up by starlight, checking their rifles more from habit than any real expectation they'd need them, and rode out toward the lights at a steady trot. The desert air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and a distant perfume of night-blooming flowers. The lights seemed to maintain their distance, no matter how the riders adjusted their pace, always hovering just beyond reach, like the pot of gold at the rainbow's end. They rode for the better part of an hour, guided by the glow that should have been getting closer but somehow never did. The lights would dim almost to nothing, then flare back to full brightness. They clustered together like a meeting of conspirators, then scatter across the horizon like startled birds. Ellison had the uncomfortable sensation that he was being observed, though there was nothing out there but empty desert and the indifferent stars. His horse grew increasingly nervous, ears pinned back, and nostrils flaring, picking up on something its rider couldn't perceive. The other mounts showed the same agitation, tossing their heads and sidestepping as though something in the air itself troubled them. Finally, Whitehall called a halt. They set their horses in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness in every direction, except for those damn lights still dancing in the distance. "This doesn't make sense," the trail boss said, and there was something in his voice Ellison had never heard before. Not fear exactly, but a deep unease, the sound of a practical man confronting something that violated every rule of the world he understood. They watched for another 15 minutes as the lights performed their mysterious ballet, when Whitehall turned his horse back toward camp. Nobody spoke during the ride back, each man alone with his thoughts and the memory of lights that shouldn't exist. The next morning, Ellison rode out to where they'd been the night before, looking for tracks or any sign of riders, any explanation that would let the world make sense again. He found nothing but undisturbed desert, the sandy soil showing only the hoof prints from their own horses. No campfire remains, no footprints, no evidence that anyone else had ever been anywhere near Mitchell Flat. The experience troubled him enough that when they reached Fort Worth and the herd was sold, he wrote a letter to his sister describing what he'd seen. The letter would eventually make its way into a local newspaper, becoming the first documented account of what would later be known as the Marfa Lights. Robert Ellison lived to be 87 years old, dying peacefully in his bed in 1951. He became a successful rancher, a respected member of his community, a man known for his honesty and practical good sense. He saw the lights dozens and more times over the years, sometimes alone on night rides, sometimes with companions who could verify he wasn't just imagining things. He never wavered in his account of that first encounter, never embellished or exaggerated, never claimed to know what the lights were. When asked about them in years later, he'd just shake his head and say they were there, real as anything, and that was all anyone could say for certain. The lights didn't care whether folks believed in them or not. They would keep on shining long after all the witnesses had traveled into the stars. Chapter 2, Night Patrol, 1916. Deputy Marshal Tom Ashford had been riding the border country for 6 years when he encountered the lights long enough to think he'd seen everything in West Texas had to offer in the way of the strange and troublesome phenomena. He tracked bandits through Big Bend, faced down armed smugglers at midnight crossings of the Rio Grande, and spent more nights under the stars than he cared to count. The border was a lawless place in 1916, with revolution burning through Mexico and all manner of desperate men flowing north seeking opportunity or escape. Ashford's job was to maintain some semblance of order in a region where chaos was the natural state of things, and he took the responsibility seriously. The night started ordinary enough. A routine patrol south from Presidio along the River Road, checking for signs of recent crossings or cash contraband. Ashford rode a sturdy roan mare named Cisco, who'd proven herself steady under fire and sure-footed in rough country. The moon was 3 days from full, providing enough light to see by without completely ruining his night vision. He covered maybe 20 miles when Cisco suddenly dropped dead in the trail, ears forward and every muscle tense. Ashford trusted the mare's instincts more than his own sometimes, so he sat quiet and let his eyes adjust to the darkness ahead. That's when he saw the first light, about a quarter-mile distant and maybe 6 feet off the ground. It was orange-red, bright enough to cast a faint glow on the desert vegetation below it, and it hung there motionless, like a lantern suspended from a visible wire. Ashford's first thought was smugglers, probably using the light as a signal to Confederates on the Mexican side. He dismounted it and ground-tied Cisco, then moved forward on foot with his Winchester lever-action .30-30 at the ready, using the sparse cover of creosote bushes to mask his approach. The light didn't move, didn't flicker, just maintained that steady, unnatural glow. When he cut the distance by half, 2 more lights appeared to the east of the first, these white, yellow, and slightly smaller. They emerged without warning, as if someone had suddenly uncovered a trio of lanterns that had been burning all along. Ashford froze, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. If these were smugglers, they were being incredibly obvious about it, and it didn't match his experience with how such men operated. And there were no visible sources for the lights, no figures holding lanterns, no campfires, just the illumination itself hanging in midair like fireflies grown to impossible size. The 3 lights began to move in perfect synchronization, tracking north across Ashford's field of vision at about the speed of a walking man. He worked the lever on his Winchester, chambering around more from habit than any clear intention to shoot. What the hell was he going to shoot at? The lights themselves? He fought Apaches and outlaws, faced down lynch mobs and rabid animals, but this was something altogether different. This violated the basic rules of how the world worked, and Tom Ashford didn't appreciate having his understanding of reality challenged by unexplainable lights in the middle of a routine patrol. He decided to follow them, staying parallel to their course, and using the terrain to keep himself concealed. The lights maintained their formation and their pace, seemingly indifferent to his presence. After about 15 minutes, they stopped abruptly, hovering in place for nearly a minute before the center light suddenly shot upward. Climbing to perhaps 30 feet in the air, it hung there briefly, pulsing brighter and dimmer like a beating heart, then descended just as quickly to rejoin its companions. Ashford had seen artillery flares during the Spanish War, but those followed ballistic trajectories, climbing and falling in predictable arcs. This thing had moved straight up and straight down, controlled and deliberate. His mare whined from behind him, a sound of pure equine nervousness, and Ashford realized he had left her too far back. He retreated to where he ground-tied Cisco, finding the horse wide-eyed and trembling, but holding her position like the professional she was. He spoke to her quietly, keeping his voice low and reassured while his eyes never left the lights. They were on the move again, this time heading west toward the foothills of the Chenati Mountain. As Ashford watched, a fourth light appeared from behind a low rise, bright blue-white and moving faster than the others, like a late arrival hurrying to catch up with its companions. He made a decision then that he questioned for the rest of his life. He was going to get closer, close enough to see what was generating these lights if it meant riding right up to them. He mounted Cisco and urged her forward at a walk, expecting resistance, but finding the mare willing enough once they were moving. The lights were perhaps 100 yards distant now, and Ashford could see that they were casting shadows on the ground below them, which meant they were substantial sources of illumination, not reflections or optical illusions. The shadows moved as the lights moved, proving these were physical phenomena of some kind, even if their nature remained mysterious. At 50 yards, Cisco refused to go any further, planting her feet and snorting in a way that brooked no argument. Ashford didn't blame her. Even from this distance, he could feel something wrong about the lights, a quality to the air itself that made his skin prickle and his teeth ache. The illumination they cast was cold somehow, not the warm glow of firelight or steady beam of an electric lamp, but something that seemed to suck heat from the world rather than generate it. The lights were perhaps 6 to 8 feet in diameter, perfectly spherical and absolutely motionless now, arranged in a rough diamond pattern like they were waiting for something. Then as sudden as they appeared, they were gone, not dimming gradually or moving out of sight, but simply ceasing to exist between one heartbeat and the next. The desert darkness rushed back in, seeming deeper than before, and Ashford sat alone on his nervous horse, wondering if he'd lost his mind. He dismounted with shaking hands and walked to where the lights had been, finding nothing but undisturbed dirt and desert vegetation, showing no signs of scorching or disturbance. Whatever he'd witnessed, it had left no physical trace, no evidence that could be documented in a report or presented to his superiors as proof. Tom Ashford rode back to the Presidio in silence, wrote nothing in his patrol log about the lights, and never spoke of the incident to anyone for 37 years, not until he was an old man in a nursing home and figured his reputation couldn't suffer anymore. Chapter 3. The Prospector's Burden, 1901. Dutch Sam Keller was 53 years old in the autumn of 1901. He'd been prospecting the Trans-Pecos region for silver since before the turn of the century. He was known among few prospectors, remained in the territory for following abandoned leads and working claims that richer operators wouldn't waste their time on. He was lean and weathered as jerky. His hands were calloused, hard from swinging a pickaxe, and eyes that learned to spot the faint gleam of ore and unpromising rock. Sam lived out of a patched canvas tent and a pair of saddlebags, moving from claim to claim like a ghost haunting the mountains and seeking his fortune through dusty skies. He'd grown so accustomed to solitude that the sound of his own voice sometimes startled him when he spoke aloud to his mule, a gray animal he'd named Sterling, after the silver he hoped to find. Sam had been working a played-out silver vein near the base of the Chisos Mountains for 3 weeks when supplies ran low, enough to require a trip into Alpine for beans and Copenhagen snuff tobacco. The ride would take 2 days each way, and Sam learned long ago to travel at night during the hot months, letting Sterling pick his way by starlight while the temperature was bearable. He broke camp at sunset, loaded his minimal gear onto the mule's pack saddle, and set out across the flatlands following a route he'd traveled dozens of times before. The evening air was clear and cool, scented with creosote and that indefinable smell that meant autumn in the high desert. Around sunset, as Sam crossed the flattest stretch of the journey between the Chenati Mountains and the distant lights of Alpine, he noticed a glow to his left, maybe half a mile distant. At first he thought it might be another prospector's campfire, though it seemed odd that anyone would camp so far from water or shelter. As he adjusted his course slightly, meaning to pass close enough to hail whoever it was, something about the light struck him wrong. The light was too bright and too concentrated for any campfire Sam had ever seen. It was too steady, burning with an intensity no natural flame could produce, and it floated above the ground without any visible source or support. The thing pulsed gently, rhythmically, like something breathing, or like a beating heart suspended in the darkness. It had a yellow-white quantity that reminded Sam of arc lights he'd seen in the mining operations of Terlingua. But there was no mine out here, no structure, no reason for such illumination. The sight of it made his skin prickle with an unease he couldn't name, and he felt his breath catch in his chest. Sterling stopped walking without any command from Sam, planting his feet and lowering his head in the stubborn way that he meant he wasn't going any further in that direction. Sam had learned over the years to respect the animal's instincts in matters of danger. Mules had a sense for snakes and bad water and unstable ground that humans lacked, and Sterling had kept him alive more than once. If the mule didn't want to approach the light, then Sam was inclined to honor that judgment. He dismounted and hobbled the animal where it stood, then continued on foot, moving slowly and carefully across the rocky ground. The light remained stationary, pulsing something alive, and as Sam's eyes adjusted to the darkness around that brilliant core, he could make out what looked like the tendrils of illumination extending downward toward the ground, reaching like a root of some passable plant trying to anchor itself to earth. When Sam had closed to perhaps 200 yards, the single light split apart into 5 distinct orbs, each one maintaining the same yellow-white glow and the same fierce brightness. They arranged themselves in a perfect geometric pattern, not random, not scattered, but precise as surveyors' marks. The orbs began to rotate slowly around the invisible center point, maintaining exact distances from each other, like they were connected by invisible spokes. The movement was too precise, too controlled to be any natural phenomenon Sam could think of. There was no wind to move them, no atmospheric disturbance, nothing to explain why these lights should move in such a perfect coordination. They rose and fell in synchronization, performing movements that defied what Sam understood about how things move through the air, like parts of a single machine, operating according to principles he couldn't begin to comprehend. Sam sat down on a flat boulder and watched the display, feeling something close to religious, all mixed with the prospector's natural skepticism and the glowing sense of fear. He lost track of time completely, mesmerized by the strange beauty and terrible wrongness of what he witnessed. It might have been 10 minutes, or it might have been an hour. He couldn't say. The air around him felt different somehow, changed with static electricity that made the hair on his arm stand up. When he pulled his pocket watch from his vest to check the time, he found the hands had stopped, frozen at midnight exactly. A low humming sound, barely audible but persistent, seemed to come from inside his own head rather than from the lights themselves. The orbs seemed to be showing him something, performing for him, though what message they might contain was beyond his understanding. Whatever this was, it wasn't ball lighting or marsh gas or swamp lights or any other natural phenomenon he'd heard old-timers talk about around campfires. Without warning, the lights began to rise toward the stairs in a loose formation that maintained their geographic spacing. It climbed steadily upward, then suddenly accelerated with a speed that no balloon or bird or anything Sam knew of could match. The orbs ascended until they were barely distinguishable from the stars themselves, still moving in that perfect coordination. Then they simply vanished, not fading gradually like a candle guttered out, but disappearing instantaneously, all at once, like someone had snuffed them out with a giant hand. The desert darkness returned complete and absolute, and Sam sat in silence, his heart hammering against his ribs, and his breath coming quick and shallow like he'd been running. When he fumbled for his pocket watch again with shaking hands, he found it started ticking, though, according to its face, nearly an hour had passed since it had stopped. Sam made his way back to Sterling on unsteady legs and found the mule had settled down and was placidly chewing whatever vegetation it had found worth eating. He built a small fire from dead creosote wood, more for the companionship of flame than for any warmth. He sat watching it while his mind worked through what he just witnessed. He was a practical man who believed in orassays and geographical surveys, and hard work and harder luck, and the things you can touch and weigh and sell for money at the assayer's office. But he also knew the desert held secrets, and that the land out here was old beyond human reckoning, and patient in ways that civilization couldn't begin to comprehend. What he'd seen wasn't just lights dancing on the horizon. It was something that moved with purpose and intelligence, something that operated according to rules that had nothing to do with the natural world he understood. Sam completed his trip to Alpine the next day, bought his supplies from the general store, and returned to his claim without mentioning the lights to a single soul. What would he have said to the men in town? That he'd seen flying machines in the desert sky, glowing orbs that moved in impossible ways and made time itself stop? People already thought prospectors were half crazy from too much sun and solitude, from drinking bad water and talking to mules. There was no need to reinforce that opinion by spouting off about things that couldn't be explained. Over the years, Sam had heard other prospectors tell strange stories around campfires, tales of lights in the deserts and sounds that had no source, and he'd always dismissed such talk as a product of loneliness and whiskey. Now he wondered what those men had really seen out there in the darkness, what they'd witnessed, what they couldn't put into proper words. He worked his claim for another 2 months, pulling just enough silver to keep to himself and beans and tobacco, and during that time he saw the lights again on several occasions, always at a distance, always mysterious and unexplainable. In early December, Sam struck a small vein that proved more productive than anything he'd found in years. It wasn't enough to make him rich, but it was sufficient to give him a comfortable stake and maybe think about retiring to some place with fewer scorpions and more shade. He always wondered in the corner of his mind he didn't examine too closely whether there might be some connection between the lights and his sudden good fortune, whether whatever intelligence guided those orbs had somehow led him to this silver. Probably not. Probably just a coincidence and the random generosity of geology. But on certain nights when he saw the lights performing their inexplicable dance across the flatlands near the Chenati Mountains, he'd nod to them like neighbors passing on a street. When Sam finally did quit prospecting in 1903 and moved to a boarding house in Marathon, he left behind his picks and pans, his tent, and his technical knowledge of geology, but he carried the memory of those lights with him until his dying day. He'd tell the story sometimes in his later years when whiskey and reminiscence got the better of his natural reticence. Speaking of the night, he'd seen something impossible hovering over the desert where folks were starting to call the Marfa Lights country. People would smile and nod and figure the old prospector had spent too many years alone in the Trans-Pecos, breathing dust and chasing silver that wasn't there. That was fine with Sam. He knew what he'd seen, and he knew the desert didn't owe anyone an explanation for its mysteries. Some things were mysteries not because they couldn't be understood, but because understanding them wasn't the point. The point was bearing witness to wonder when it presented itself, accepting that the world held things beyond human comprehension, and carrying that sense of possibility and terror forward into all ordinary days that followed. Chapter 4. The Ranger's Vigil, 1935. Texas Ranger Jack McCormick sat in his dust-covered Ford coupe on the shoulder of Highway 67, 8 miles east of Marfa, watching the sunset paint the Chenati Mountains in shades of copper and rust. It was late July of 1935, deep in the Depression, and McCormick had been chasing a bootlegger named Vernon Sims across 3 counties for the better part of a week. The chase had finally ended that afternoon, with Sims wrapped around a telephone pole and McCormick standing in the wreckage, filling out paperwork while the coroner's wagon hauled away what was left. Now he was tired, hungry, and in no particular hurry to drive the remaining distance to Marfa for a meal and a bed. He stopped at this particular spot because it offered a clear view across Mitchell Flat, and McCormick had learned over his 15 years as a ranger that sometimes the best police work was simply sitting still and watching the world reveal its secrets. He had a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a cigarette, and as the light faded from the sky, he settled in to enjoy the quiet and the vast emptiness that made West Texas both beautiful and lonesome. The radio in the Ford crackled with static. He was too far from any station for a clear signal, so he switched it off and let the silence fill the car. The lights appeared just after dark, emerging without warning from the direction of the mountains. At first, McCormick thought they might be the headlights from a distant vehicle, but the trajectory was wrong, and the color didn't match. These were orange-yellow bright, enough to be visible at what he judged was 3 or 4 miles distance, and they moved with a fluid grace that no automobile could manage. McCormick straightened in his seat, suddenly alert, his lawman's instincts firing on all cylinders. This was his jurisdiction, and anything unusual happening in it was his business by definition. He grabbed the binoculars from the glove box and focused on the lights, finding them even stranger when magnified. They appeared as perfect as spheres of luminescence, casting no beam or halo, simply glowing with an inner radiance that seemed to have no point source. As he watched, 2 more lights appeared, these white blue and smaller than the originals. They moved to flank the larger lights, forming a rough V shape that reminded McCormick of military aircraft flying in formation. But these weren't aircraft. They made no sound, showing no navigation lights, and moved too slowly for anything with wings. McCormick was a methodical man, trained to observe and document rather than jump to conclusions. He noted the time, 8:47 p.m., according to his pocket watch, and began mentally recording details: color, size, position, direction of travel, anything that might prove relevant to understanding what he was witnessing. The lights moved north across Mitchell Flat at perhaps 10 or 15 miles per hour, maintaining their formation with what seemed like deliberate precision. They rose and fell slightly with the contours of the land, staying at a constant height above the ground level, like pilots following terrain. After about 20 minutes, the lights changed their behavior. The 2 smaller white-blue orbs suddenly accelerated, shooting ahead of the larger lights at a speed that McCormick's experienced eye judged to be at least 60 miles per hour, maybe faster. They traveled in perfectly straight lines for perhaps half a mile, then stopped dead, not slowing down like a vehicle braking, but simply seizing all forward motion instantly. McCormick had seen barnstormer pilots perform aerobic stunts, but nothing that violated physics the way these lights just had. No aircraft could stop that fast without tearing itself apart. The larger orange-yellow lights had continued their steady pace, and now the white-blue lights reversed course. Racing back to rejoin the formation, they merged with the larger lights in a burst of illumination, bright enough that McCormick instinctively raised his head to shield his eyes, and when the flare subsided, there was only a single light remaining, pulsing with multiple colors like a signal lamp cycling through filters. This solitary orb maintained its position for several minutes, while McCormick watched through the binoculars, his cop's mind working through explanations and finding each one inadequate. He decided to approach the phenomenon more closely, see if he could determine its nature through direct investigation. McCormick started the Ford and drove slowly down a dirt track that cut across Mitchell Flat toward where the light hovered. The track was rough, barely more than parallel ruts carved by ranch vehicles, and the coupe bounced and rattled as it crept forward. He kept his eyes on the light, which seemed to maintain its distance no matter how far he drove. After covering what must have been 2 miles, the light was no closer than where he'd started. If anything, it appeared more distant, as if it was retreating at exactly the pace he advanced. McCormick stopped the car and killed the engine, sitting in the darkness with only the light ahead for company. He could hear the Ford's engine ticking as it cooled, the whisper of wind across the desert, the distant call of a night bird. The light pulsed 3 times in quick succession, red, white, blue, then split apart into 7 or 8 smaller orbs that scattered across the horizon like a startled quail. They moved independently now, each following its own trajectory, some rising high while others hugged the ground, creating patterns that seemed almost choreographed in their complexity. For the next hour, Jack McCormick sat in his Ford and watched the lights perform their mysterious dance. He saw them merge and separate, brighten and dim, trace geometric patterns and chaotic swirls across the empty desert. He saw them move with intelligence and purpose, responding with each and other in ways that suggested communication or coordination beyond anything he could explain. When they finally faded from view around 11 o'clock, disappearing as abruptly as they appeared, McCormick sat in the darkness for another 15 minutes, trying to process what he'd witnessed and failing to fit it into any framework that made sense. He drove into Marfa, filed his report on the bootlegger Sims, and never mentioned the lights in any official capacity. What would he have written? That he'd seen unexplained aerial phenomena while conducting surveillance? Those mysterious lights operating in his jurisdiction without his permission or understanding? McCormick had built a reputation as a solid, reliable ranger, and he wasn't about to jeopardize that by including accounts of ghost lights in his paperwork. But he carried the memory with him, and over the remaining 23 years of his career, he saw the lights half a dozen more times, always from a distance, always unexplained. He died in 1958, taking whatever conclusions he'd reached about the Marfa Lights to his grave, leaving behind only a brief notion in his personal journal. Saw them again. Still didn't know what the hell they are. Maybe that's the point. Chapter 5. The Cattleman's Vigil, 1892. Charles Goodnight was 56 years old in the spring of 1892. He was already a living legend among cattlemen across Texas and the entire American West. He had pioneered the Goodnight Loving Trail with Oliver Loving back in 1866, driving cattle through country so dangerous most men wouldn't consider it even with an army escort. He survived Indian raids and droughts and blizzards, outlasted rustlers and market crashes, and every variety of hardship the frontier could devise. He built the J.A. Ranch in Palo Duro Canyon into one of the most successful cattle operations in Texas, managing hundreds of thousands of acres and employing dozens of cowhands. Goodnight was a man who believed in what he could see and measure and count, who had little patience for superstition or tall tales that cowboys told around campfires. But the West had shown him enough strange things over the decades to keep him humble about the limits of human understanding. Goodnight was traveling alone from the J.A. Ranch down to inspect property near Marfa, considering whether to expand his operations into the Trans-Pecos region. He was riding a sturdy buckskin gelding. He trained himself, an animal with good wind and better sense, the kind of horse a man could trust in difficult country. He was taking the journey slowly, camping along the way, and enjoying the solitude after years of managing men and cattle and all the business complications that came with running a large ranch. He'd been on the trail for 4 days when he made camp on Mitchell Flat, choosing a spot near a dry wash where centuries of erosion had created a natural windbreak. The evening was clear and cool, perfect weather for late spring in West Texas, and Goodnight built his fire small and efficient, the way a man who'd spent his life outdoors naturally would. Goodnight had his bedroll laid out on the level ground, his horse picketed nearby on a long rope, and would let the animal graze. His coffee was boiling in a battered tin pot balanced on rocks over coals. He was cleaning his rifle with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been maintaining firearms since before the Civil War. The sun had set an hour earlier behind the distant mountains, and stars were beginning to show in the deepening blue of the sky. He'd always loved this time of evening, a quiet transitional period between day and night, when the world seemed to pause and take a breath. He was thinking about the water rights and grazing land, running calculations in his head about whether Marfa country could support a substantial herd year-round. Then his buckskin nickered nervously, a sound Goodnight had learned to pay attention to, and the horse's ears came forward, alert and focused on something in the distance. Goodnight looked up from his rifle maintenance and saw lights to the south, 3 of them hovering above the desert, maybe about a half a mile out. They were bright yellow-white, steady and unmoving in the still air, clearly visible against the darkening landscape. His first thought was of other travelers making camp for the night, maybe a survey crew or prospectors heading into the mountains. But the lights were wrong somehow, too high off the ground, too bright and concentrated to be campfires. No campfire burned with that kind of intensity, and no lantern could throw that much light unless it was something he knew he hadn't encountered. He sat down his rifle carefully and stood, brushing dust from his pants, and watched the lights with the careful attention of a man whose survival had often depended on assessing unusual situations. Goodnight had seen ball lightning during thunderstorms on the Llano Estacado, had witnessed strange atmospheric effects in the high plains that can make distant mountains seem to float in the air. He'd seen mirages in the desert that looked as real as anything, phantom lakes and non-existent buildings that vanished when you approached them. But this was different. From all those experiences, these lights had a solidity to them, a physical presence. They weren't flickering or wavering like reflections or heat distortions would. They weren't moving with random patterns of natural phenomena. They just hung there in the darkness, perfectly steady and absolutely real. His horse was growing more agitated by the moment, pulling hard at its picket rope and rolling its eyes white, showing the kind of fear horses displayed around predators or fire. The three lights began to move in a tight formation, traveling east to west across Goodnight's field of vision at about the speed of a walking horse. But they didn't bob or sway the way lanterns being carried would, didn't vary their height or spacing as riders on horseback inevitably would. They maintained perfect distances between them, maybe 20 feet separating each light, and they stayed at a constant altitude above the ground that seemed to be about 10 feet. Then one light separated from the others without any change in speed or trajectory, simply rose straight up into the air about 50 feet, like it was being pulled by invisible wires, and stopped as abruptly as it started climbing. It hung there motionless, while the other two continued their horizontal movement below. Goodnight had commanded men during the Civil War. He had seen cavalry units drill and execute complex maneuvers on parade grounds and battlefields. This reminded him of the kind of coordinated movement, the precision and discipline of trained soldiers following orders, but no military operation he'd ever witnessed, and he'd witnessed plenty, moved with this kind of perfection. The elevated light began to pulse rhythmically, bright, then dim, then bright again, in a steady pattern, like it was signaling to the others below or communicating information Goodnight couldn't interpret. The two remaining lights responded by changing color simultaneously, shifting from yellow-white to orange-red in perfect synchronization, and Goodnight felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Whether these things were, they were operating with intelligence and purpose. Goodnight made a decision based on 60 years of frontier experience and a lifetime of confronting unknown situations head-on. He was going to get closer to these lights, see what they actually were instead of speculating from a distance. He walked to his horse and saddled the nervous buckskin, speaking in low, calming tones where the animal shifted and fidgeted. The horse didn't want to move toward the lights, made that clear with every muscle in its body, but Goodnight was a firm horseman, and the buckskin had been trained to obey. He mounted up and rode at a walk toward where the lights hovered, keeping his posture relaxed and his hand near his rifle, though he strongly suspected the weapon would be useless against whatever he was approaching. He covered maybe 200 yards across the flat desert, the lights growing larger and brighter as he advanced, before his horse planted its feet and refused to go any further despite Goodnight's urging. From this distance, maybe 300 yards out, Goodnight could see the lights with much greater clarity. They were spherical. He judged them to be maybe 8 or 10 feet in diameter, glowing with an inner radiance that seemed to have no visible source or fuel. They cast a distant glow on the ground beneath them, creating shadows from rocks and vegetation, which meant they were real physical objects, generating actual light and not illusions or atmospheric reflections. The elevated light suddenly dropped back down to join the others, descending in one smooth motion without any sense of falling or loss of control. All three lights merged when they met, combining into a single bright orb that had to be 25 feet across. That massive sphere began to spin on its axis, slowly at first and then faster and faster until it was rotating at a speed that should have torn it apart. Then it shot straight up into the night sky with an acceleration that seemed to violate every law of physics Goodnight understood. The light climbed vertically until it was lost among the stars themselves, becoming just another point of light in the vast canopy above. Then it simply vanished between one heartbeat and the next, leaving only darkness and the faint afterimage burned into Goodnight's vision. He sat his trembling horse in complete silence, his heart pounding hard enough that he could hear it in his ears. He was a man who faced death more times than he could count, who'd stared down hostile Comanche warriors and armed outlaws without his hands shaking. But this had rattled him in a way that human violence never had shown him something that didn't fit into his carefully constructed understanding of how the world worked. He rode slowly back to his camp and sat by his fire for the rest of the night, feeding it with wood and staring into the flames. He never did fall asleep that night, just watched the stars and thought about what he'd witnessed until dawn painted the eastern horizon pink and gold. Goodnight continued his journey to Marfa the next day, inspected the property he'd come to see, and made his decision. He decided against expanding his operations into the Trans-Pecos region and told his business partners it was about insufficient water or poor grazing land. That was partially true. The country was dry and the grass was sparse compared to Polodoro Canyon. But Goodnight knew in his bones that the real reason ran deeper. Knew he didn't want his men working in a country where things like those lights appeared in the darkness. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen that night on Mitchell Flat, never mentioned it in interviews or in the brief autobiography he wrote in his years later, but to a few trusted friends in private moments, usually after several whiskeys had loosened his tongue, he'd sometimes mention that the West still held mysteries that no amount of experience or practical knowledge could prepare a man for. Charles Goodnight died in 1929 at the age of 93, one of the greatest and most successful cattlemen Texas ever produced, a practical man who built an empire through hard work and sound judgment. But he'd seen something on Mitchell Flat in the spring of 1892 that didn't fit his understanding of the natural world, something that reminded him that for all of mankind's accomplishments and progresses, the world still contained things that existed beyond human comprehension. He carried that knowledge with him for the remaining 37 years of his life, and it made him more thoughtful and perhaps more humble about humanity's place in the grand scheme of things. Chapter 6. The Surveyor's Map, 1923. Howard Gentry had been surveying West Texas for the State Land Office since before the Great War, and he prided himself on the accuracy of his maps and the precision of his measurements. He used a transit and a steel chain, a compass, and dead reckoning, and 23 years of experience that let him read terrain the way some men read books. His job was to establish and verify property boundaries, locate section corners, and create detailed topographical maps of regions that were often barely inhabited and poorly documented. It was exacting work that required patience and mathematical precision, and Gentry loved it with the quiet passion some men reserve for whiskey or women. He'd been contacted by a syndicate out of San Antonio to survey a large tract north of Marfa, land they were considering for some development scheme Gentry didn't understand and didn't need to. His job was to map it, not to question the business sense of building anything in a country where people were scarce and neighbors were scarcer. He set up his base camp on Mitchell Flat, erected his survey monuments, and spent the past week walking transects and recording elevations, building a picture of the land that would eventually become ink lines on paper. On the 8th night of the survey, Gentry was working late, taking star sights to verify his position and ensure calculations were accounting properly for magnetic declination. He had his transit set up on a steel tripod, his notebooks arranged on a folding table, and a kerosene lantern providing enough light to see his instruments and record his figures. The night was clear and still, perfect for the astronomical observations that were the most satisfying part of his work. He was sighting on a Polaris when he noticed a light in his peripheral vision that didn't belong to the star field he'd memorized over years of night work. He shifted his attention from the eyepiece and looked directly at the anomaly. It was low on the southern horizon, bright yellow-white, and was definitely not a star. Wrong color, wrong position, and it was moving laterally across his field of view. Gentry's first thought was aircraft, though he'd seen few planes in this region, and none that flew at night. He tracked the light with his eyes, noting the steady pace and the unwavering altitude, and felt his scientific curiosity overriding his immediate need to complete the survey work. He pulled out a notebook and began recording observations, time, position relative to known landmarks, apparent size and color, rate, and direction of movement. Gentry approached unknown phenomena the way he approached survey work, with careful documentation and an assumption that everything had an explanation if you gathered sufficient data. The light had traveled perhaps 10 degrees across the horizon when it was joined by two more lights, these smaller and bluish-white. They appeared to emerge from behind a low rise, though Gentry knew there was nothing out there but flat desert for miles. The three lights arranged themselves in a triangular formation and continued their eastward journey. Gentry estimated their distance at approximately 2 miles and their height above ground at between 8 and 12 feet. Though there were rough calculations based on the limited reference points, he noted that they cast a visible glow on the ground below them, which meant they were substantial light sources and not some optical illusion or atmospheric effect. The surveyor in him wanted to triangulate their exact position, but he lacked the necessary instruments and reference points for that level of precision. Over the next 45 minutes, the lights performed maneuvers that Gentry documented with increasing frustration at his inability to explain what he was witnessing. They separated and rejoined, changed colors from yellow to orange to red, varied their altitude and speed, and generally behaved in ways that violated his understanding of natural phenomena. He considered ball lighting, but the weather was clear with no electrical activity. He considered will-o-wisps, but the desert was too dry for the decomposing organic matter that supposedly generated such effects. He ran through every possible explanation his scientifically trained mind could produce, and found each one inadequate. Finally, Gentry made a decision that would alter the course of his evening and stick in his memory for decades. He was going to approach these lights, take measurements, and gather empirical data that might provide answers that observation from a distance couldn't yield. He grabbed his transit and his measuring chain, loaded them into the bed of his Model T truck, and drove across the desert toward where the lights hovered. The truck bounced and rattled over the rough terrain, headlights cutting pale beams across the darkness, and Gentry felt like the peculiar mix of scientific excitement and primitive unease that comes from confronting the genuinely unknown. He got within perhaps 500 yards of the lights when his truck engine died. Not sputtering or coughed or showed any signs of mechanical distress, just stopped dead as if someone had cut the ignition. Gentry tried the starter, pumped the gas, checked the kill switch, did everything a man could do to resurrect a bulky engine, and got nothing. The truck was as dead as a stone, sitting in the middle of the desert with the lights hovering ahead like they were waiting to see what he'd do next. Gentry sat there for a long moment, his surveyor's rationality wearing, with a deeper instinct that suggested approaching these lights might not be the wisest course of action. The lights pulsed twice, 3 times, then rose straight up into the sky like rockets launched from invisible platforms. They climbed until they were indistinguishable from the stars and simply vanished, winking out of existence or accelerating beyond visibility faster than Gentry's eyes could track. He sat alone in his dead truck, heart pounding and hands shaking slightly, and tried the starter one more time. The engine caught immediately, coughing to life as it never had any problem at all. Gentry drove slowly back to his camp, completed his survey over the following 3 days, and never mentioned the lights in his official report, but he kept his personal observations filed away in a notebook that eventually made its way to the University of Texas archives. One more piece of documentation in the long history of witnesses who'd seen something unexplainable over the West Texas desert. Chapter 7, The Gambler's Hand, 1882. John Henry Doc Holliday was 31 years old in the summer of 1882, and he was already dying from tuberculosis that had been consuming him slowly for years. He left Tombstone, Arizona behind after all the troubles with the Earp brothers and the aftermath of the street fight near the OK Corral, and now he was drifting through the Southwest, looking for dry air and somewhere to die in relative peace. His reputation as a gambler and a gunfighter preceded him everywhere he went, and towns either welcomed the famous Doc Holliday with his stories and his card skills, or they politely but firmly asked him to move along before his presence attracted trouble. He was thin as a rail, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, coughing up blood most mornings into handkerchiefs he'd throw away because washing them was more trouble than they were worth. But his hands were still steady when they needed to be, and his eyes were still sharp enough to read a man's intentions. across a card table. Doc had heard that West Texas had the kind of desert climate that sometimes helped consumptives breathe easier, and he decided to try his luck in the scattered towns out there. He'd been gambling in El Paso for 2 weeks, winning more than he lost and keeping to himself, when the local law had suggested politely that it might be time for him to move along. He was headed toward Fort Davis now. He had heard there were decent card games there and a hotel that didn't ask too many questions. He was traveling in a rented buggy because he was too weak to ride horseback for long distances anymore, though he hated admitting it even to himself. He had his nickel-plated Colt pistol and a deck of cards, and that was really all a man like Doc Holliday needed in this world. The journey across the desert was brutal, even in the evening hours. The heat was still radiating up from the ground long after the sun had set, but Doc had long ago stopped complaining about physical discomfort. When you were dying by inches, everything hurt, and there wasn't much point in cataloging it. He stopped to make camp on Mitchell Flat as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Too exhausted to continue any further that day, the coughing fits had worn him down more than usual, left him weak and shaking. He unhitched the horse from the buggy and let it graze on the sparse desert grass, then built a small fire from dead creosote wood, though he had no appetite for food and wouldn't bother cooking anything. He poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey from the bottle he carried in his coat, whiskey being the only thing besides laudanum that seemed to help this cough anymore, or at least made him care less about it. He sat wrapped in a wool blanket, despite the lingering warmth of the desert evening, consumption having left him perpetually cold, always shivering, even when the temperature would make other men sweat. A violent coughing fit seized him around 9 o'clock, one of the bad ones that felt like his lungs were trying to tear themselves out of his chest. It doubled him over, left him gasping and spitting blood into his handkerchief, dark red stains that he'd stopped being shocked by years ago. When he finally caught his breath and looked up with his watering eyes, he saw lights hovering in the desert to the west, maybe a quarter mile out. At first he thought it was his fevered mind playing tricks on him, showing him things that weren't there. He had hallucinations before from the laudanum he took for the pain, seen all manner of strange visions dancing at the edges of his perception, but these lights seemed solid and real in a way his drug dreams never had, and his horse was spooked by them, dancing nervously at the end of its tether, which meant they weren't just in his head. Doc wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand and watched the lights carefully through narrowed eyes. There were 4 of them, arranged in a perfect diamond pattern, like a suit on a playing card, and they were glowing with a blue and white intensity he'd never seen in any lamp or fire. They were hovering above the desert floor, perfectly motionless despite being a steady breeze across the flat. No sound came from them, no crackle of flame or hiss of gas, no indication at all of what they might be or what was generating that fierce light. Doc had seen many strange things in his 31 years of hard living, had killed men in gunfights and watched men die from disease and violence, had witnessed the worst that humanity could offer, and a few things that might have been better, but this was something altogether different, something that made his skin prickle despite his fever. The light began moving toward his position, slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world and were in no particular hurry. Doc reached for his nickel-plated pistol out of pure habit, drew it from the holster at his hip, and held it loosely in his hand. He knew it was probably foolish to think he could shoot lights, but holding a gun made him feel less vulnerable, gave him some illusion of control over a situation that was rapidly moving beyond his understanding. The lights came within 100 yards of his camp and stopped, hovering there in perfect formation. Then one separated from the others and drifted closer, moving with the same unhurried deliberation. Doc stood on shaky legs, using the buggy wheel to steady himself, and faced the approaching light. He faced death so many times in so many forms that he figured this was just another way to meet it. Doc Holliday had never been one to run from anything. This single light approached maybe 50 feet from where Doc stood, swaying slightly, close enough that he could see it clearly despite his fever-blurred vision. It was larger than he initially thought, maybe 10 or 12 feet across, a perfect sphere of pulsing blue-white radiance. Doc could feel warmth radiating from it, or maybe that was just his fever spiking again. He couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't separate what was real from what his dying body was telling him. The light seemed to be examining him, studying him with what felt like intelligence and curiosity. Though Doc couldn't have explained how he knew that, he stared back at it defiantly, his gun hand steady, even though the rest of him was shaking. Doc Holliday had never backed down from anything in his short, violent life, and he wasn't about to start now, just because he was facing something that made no earthly sense. Something happened then that Doc could never fully explain, not even to himself in the private moments when he'd lie awake at night thinking about it. The light pulsed brighter, much brighter, and he felt something inside his head, not pain exactly, but pressure, like thoughts that weren't his own or trying to push their way into his mind. He saw images, flashes of things he couldn't comprehend, vast distances between points of light that might have been stars, impossible spaces that seemed to fold in on themselves, geometric patterns that hurt to look at. For just a moment, maybe only seconds, but it felt like hours, he forgot about his dying lungs and the constant pain that had been his companion for years. He forgot about Tombstone and the men he killed and the reputation that followed him like a shadow. He felt something like peace, or maybe just acceptance, a sense that his small, violent life was part of something much larger than he'd ever imagined. Then the light pulled back suddenly, retreated to rejoin the others in their diamond formation. All four lights rose into the night sky together, climbing higher and higher with smooth acceleration until they vanished among the stars themselves. Doc stood there in the darkness, shaking violently now, whether from cold or fear or wonder he honestly didn't know. His coughing fit had stopped completely. He realized for the first time in hours he couldn't breathe without that terrible tightness in his chest, without feeling like he was drowning in his own blood. The relief lasted maybe 10 minutes, a blessed reprieve. Then the familiar pressure returned to his lungs, the wheeze and the rattle. His body was continuing its slow betrayal, and he knew whatever peace the lights had given him was only temporary. Doc stayed by the fire for the rest of the night, sitting wrapped in his blanket and staring up at the stars. He didn't sleep, couldn't make himself close his eyes, just drank whiskey and thought about what he'd seen and felt. He continued to Fort Davis the next morning, played cards there for a few weeks, then moved on to other towns and other games. He never mentioned the lights anymore, never spoke a word about the night on Mitchell Flat. What would he have said? That dying Doc Holliday had seen angels or demons or something else entirely in the West Texas desert? People already thought consumption made men crazy toward the end, made them see things that weren't there and talk nonsense in their fever dreams. He didn't need to reinforce that opinion. He made it to Colorado eventually, to the sanitarium in Glenwood Springs, where the doctors promised the mountain air would help him breathe easier, though both Doc and the doctors knew that they were lying. He died on November 8th, 1887, 5 years after that night on Mitchell Flat, at the age of 36. His last words were reportedly, "This is funny," spoken while looking down at his bare feet, having always expected to die with his boots on, the way a gunfighter should. But sometimes during those final years, when the laudanum dreams took him to strange places and showed him stranger things, he'd see those lights again in his mind's eye. He'd wonder if they were real or just fever visions conjured by his dying brain, trying to make sense of all the senselessness. He'd wonder if they'd been showing him something about what came after death, offering him a glimpse of whatever lay beyond the veil that he was approaching inch by painful inch. Doc Holliday had been a gambling man his entire adult life, had bet on cards and guns and his own survival against increasingly long odds. That night on Mitchell Flat, he'd seen something that suggested bigger games were played than he'd ever imagined, stakes higher than any poker table in Tombstone or Dodge City or any of the wild towns where he made his name. And maybe, just maybe, death wasn't the final hand he'd always thought it was. Maybe it was just another door opening onto something vast and strange and unknowable, something those lights had tried to show him. He carried that possibility with him through his final years, and it made the dying a little easier, made the long nights a little less terrifying. When the end finally came in that sanitarium room, Doc Holliday went quietly, and some said there was almost a smile on his thin face, like he'd just seen the river card and he knew how the hand would play out. Chapter 8. The Outlaw's Flight, 1874. John Wesley Hardin was 21 years old in the summer of 1874. He had already had a reputation as the deadliest gunfighter in Texas. Some said he killed 15 men. Others claimed the number was closer to 30, and Hardin himself had stopped counting after the first dozen because keeping score seemed like a sort of thing a man did when he was trying to impress people. And Hardin had never needed to impress anyone. He was riding hard through West Texas with a price on his head, Texas Rangers on his trail, and warrants outstanding in multiple counties for crimes ranging from murder to horse theft. He'd been on the run since killing a deputy sheriff in Comanche County over what Hardin claimed was self-defense and what the law called cold-blooded murder. He was headed for Mexico, where the law couldn't follow, figuring he'd wait out the heat south of the border until things cooled down enough for him to move freely again. Hardin had been in the saddle for 3 days straight, changing horses when he could steal them and riding each mount nearly to death before finding another. He'd been playing in arroyos and drinking from cattle tanks, eating whatever he could shoot or steal along the way. His current horse, a bay gelding he'd taken from a ranch outside of Fort Stockton, was nearly finished foam-flecked and stumbled over ground that should have been easy traveling. But Hardin pushed the animal on through the late afternoon heat because he knew the Rangers were maybe half a day behind him, closing the distance with the patience of a man who got paid whether they brought him in alive or dead. He could feel them back there like hounds on a scent, persistent and inevitable. He made his camp as the sun set over Mitchell Flat, picketing his exhausting horse near a dry wash where some sparse grass grew. He figured to rest the animal for a few hours, let it recover enough strength to make the final push to the Rio Grande, then ride through the night when the heat wouldn't kill them both. He built a small fire in a natural depression where the light wouldn't show anyone more than 100 yards away, boiled coffee in a battered tin pot that had seen better days, and ate hardtack and jerky that tasted like leather but filled his belly. His Winchester rifle was loaded with 15 rounds and lying within an arm's reach, never more than a second away from his hands. His twin Colt revolvers were cleaned and ready in their holsters, the leather oiled and supple so the draw would be smooth if it came to that. Every sound in the darkness made his hand drift instinctively toward his guns, the skitter of a lizard across a rock, the call of a night bird, the rustle of wind through the creosote. He was a man who learned to sleep light and wake fast, who understood that any moment could bring rangers or bounty hunters or someone looking to make a reputation by killing John Wesley Hardin. Around midnight, as Hardin sat with his back against the boulder and his coffee gone cold, he saw lights to the south. At first he thought it was a campfire, maybe the rangers making camp for the night before picking up his trail again at dawn. Then he realized the lights were all wrong for a campfire, too bright and too high off the ground, and they were moving in ways that fire didn't move. They were hovering above the desert floor, maybe a quarter-mile descent, 3 distinct orbs glowing with a yellow-white intensity that reminded him of arc lights he'd seen in Abilene. But no lanterns or torches moved like these lights were moving, drifting and swaying like leaves floating on water, independent of any wind or human hand. Hardin grabbed his Winchester and used his boot to kick dirt over what remained of his fire, plunged his camp into darkness while his eyes adjusted to the starlight. Hardin was a practical man who believed in what he could shoot, what he could see with his own eyes and touch with his own hands. He believed in fast horses and faster guns, and always knowing where the exits were, and getting the drop on the other fellow before the other fellow got the drop on you. But he'd seen strange things in his years riding the Texas frontier, had heard stories from old-timers and a dozen saloons about lights in the desert that didn't behave according to natural law, about things that moved in the darkness and left no tracks, about phenomena that couldn't be explained by any science he'd heard of. He watched the lights with the wariness of a haunted animal, his mind working through possibilities and finding each one wanting. He was trying to decide if they were a threat he needed to run from, a distraction he could ignore, or something else entirely that he had no words for. The 3 lights began to move in coordinated patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost purposeful in their execution. They arranged themselves in a perfect triangle, each light maintaining exact distance from the others. then shifted onto a straight line across the horizon. They rose higher into the air, climbing to what Hardin estimated was maybe 50 feet, then dropped low until they were barely above the desert floor. They moved with a precision that suggested intelligence behind their movements, something controlling them with intention rather than random atmospheric forces. Hardin had seen military units drill on parade grounds, had watched cavalry formations execute complex maneuvers during the war. This was like that, but smoother, more perfect, movements that no human coordination could achieve. The lights changed colors as he watched, shifting from yellow to orange to a deep red that looked like coals in a forge. His horse was spooked by the display, pulling hard at its tether and rolling its eyes white, making the snorting sounds horses make when they smell something that frightens them on an instinctive level. The lights started moving towards his position, not quickly but steadily, closing the distance between themselves, where Hardin crouched in the darkness, not rushing but advancing with the inevitability of a tide coming in, of something that couldn't be stopped or turned aside. Hardin stood and levered around into his Winchester's chamber, the metallic sound sharp and clear in the desert silence. He knew it was foolish to think that he could shoot lights. He knew bullets were meant for flesh and bone, and nothing he was looking at had either of those things, but having a gun in his hands made him feel less helpless, gave him something to do besides stand and watch. The orbs came within 100 yards and stopped, hovering there perfectly still, like they were studying him, like they were taking his measure. One light separated from the others and drifted closer, moving with deliberate slowness that was somehow more unraveling than speed would have been. That single light approached maybe 50 yards from where Hardin stood, close enough that he could see it clearly in all its impossible nature. It was a sphere of pure luminescence, bigger than he'd initially thought, maybe 6 feet across or more. The thing pulsed with internal light that seemed alive somehow, organic in a way that made his skin crawl. It wasn't steady like a lantern or flickering like a flame, but pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat, like something breathing. Hardin raised the Winchester to his shoulder and sighted down the barrel at the center of the glowing sphere. His finger tightened on the trigger until he could feel the resistance of the mechanism, but he didn't fire. Couldn't make himself pull that final fraction of an inch. Something stopped him, some instinct deeper than fear or reason, some ancient part of his brain that recognized he was facing something that bullets wouldn't touch. The light pulsed brighter in response to his gesture, once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, and Hardin felt pressure in his head, like someone was pressing on his skull from inside. Then the light rose straight up into the sky, climbing faster than anything Hardin had ever seen in his life, of witnessing fast draws and galloping horses and men running from death. It shot upward like a rocket launched from the earth, accelerating impossibly as it climbed. The other 2 lights followed immediately, all 3 of them shooting towards the stars in perfect formation. They climbed until they were lost among the constellations, indistinguishable from the distant suns that filled the West Texas sky. Then they simply vanished as if they never existed, winking out of reality like candles being snuffed. The darkness rushed back and to fill the space where the lights had been, and Hardin stood alone on Mitchell Flat with his fingers still on the trigger of his Winchester. His heart was pounding against his ribs like it was trying to break free, and his hands were shaking in a way that they never shook before a gunfight. Hardin didn't sleep the rest of the night, couldn't make himself close his eyes, though exhaustion sat heavy in his bones. He sat with his back against a rock and his rifle across his knees, watching the sky for any sign the lights might return. When dawn finally broke over the desert, painting the eastern horizon in shades of pink and gold, he saddled his trembling horse and rode for the Mexican border without looking back. He made it across the Rio Grande 2 days later and stayed in Mexico for 3 years, living under assumed names and moving from town to town. He was eventually captured in Florida in 1877 and brought back to Texas in chains to face murder trial. He served 17 years in the Huntsville prison, where he studied law and claimed in letters to friends that he was a reformed man, that his killing days were behind him. He was released in 1894, practiced law briefly in Gonzales and Junction, then moved to El Paso, where he was shot dead in August of 1895 over a card game in the Acme Saloon. killed by a man who shot him in the back of the head while he was rolling dice. And all those years between Mitchell Flat and his death, through his time in Mexico, his capture and trial, his long imprisonment, his brief freedom, Hardin never spoke about the lights he seen that night. He never mentioned them in his autobiography, which he wrote in prison and which detailed every killing and narrow escape in elaborate, self-justifying prose. He never wrote about them in his letters to friends and family, never brought them up in conversation, even when the talk turned to strange occurrences on the frontier. But years later, after Hardin was in the ground in the Concordia Cemetery, a prison guard who'd worked the night shift told a reporter that Hardin had nightmares, that the most dangerous man in Texas would wake up in his cell talking about lights in the desert, about things that watched him from the darkness with intentions he couldn't fathom, about a night when he'd been running from the Texas Rangers and had encountered something that made armed lawmen seem like a lesser threat, the more comprehensible danger. John Wesley Hardin killed somewhere between 20 and 40 men during his violent life, depending on whose count you believed and whether you included the ones that couldn't be proven. He was considered the most dangerous outlaw Texas ever produced, faster with a gun than Wild Bill Hickok, meaner than John Selman, more ruthless than Ben Thompson or Kingfisher or any other outlaw or any other killers who made their names in blood. He feared no man, backed down from no fight, and approached every confrontation with the certainty that he would be walking away when the smoke cleared. But that night on Mitchell Flat, in the summer of 1874, John Wesley Hardin had been the one who felt hunted instead of the hunter. He'd been the one who felt small and insignificant under the vast desert sky, who understood that some things in the world were more terrible and more mysterious than any man with a gun could ever be. He stood in the darkness with his Winchester in his hands, facing something that made his reputation and his skill and his 30-some kills mean absolutely nothing. The lights had shown him that for all of his deadliness, for all the fear his name inspired across Texas, he was just a man, and just another witness standing under the West Texas stars, watching something that shouldn't exist according to any law he understood, carrying that knowledge forward into all the violent years that followed until someone finally put a bullet in him and sent him wherever men like him go when they die. The Marfa Lights continue to appear with reliable irregularity along the stretch of desert east of town, drawing tourists and scientists, believers and skeptics, all of them looking for answers to questions that may not have solutions. The viewing station erected by the Texas Department of Transportation sees hundreds of visitors each year, people who stand in the darkness with cameras and binoculars, hoping to witness what countless others have seen before them. Some leave disappointed, having seen only the headlights of distant vehicles traveling Highway 67. Others leave transformed, having witnessed something that changes their understanding of what's possible in the natural world. The stories collected here are fictions, imagined encounters built on the framework of fact and historical testimony that spans more than a century. Cowboys really did see strange things on Mitchell Flat in the 1880s, documented in letters and diary entries that still exist in Texas archives. Prospectors documented glowing orbs that move with apparent intelligence, lights that seem to respond to their presence in ways no natural phenomenon should. Trail bosses reported formations of lights that spooked entire herds of cattle, costing them days of work and testing their ability to maintain control. The fundamental nature of the lights hasn't changed over the decades, even as the world around them has been transformed by automobiles and electricity and all the progress of the modern age. The same impossible maneuvers, the same mysterious people, the same complete lack of physical evidence left behind. Cowboys and rangers, prospectors and surveyors, ranch hands and soldiers, all of them have stood under the vast West Texas sky and watched lights perform maneuvers that defied every explanation they could conjure. The witnesses come from every walk of life and every level of education, from every era of the region's history. They include trained military observers and casual travelers passing through, people with extensive experience in the outdoors, and people who have never left their home county before. What they share is the experience of seeing something that shouldn't exist, according to our current understanding of physics and atmospheric science, something that moves with apparent intelligence and deliberate purpose, yet leaves no physical trace behind. Something that fundamentally changed how they understood the world and their place in it. Scientific explanations have been proposed and evaluated over the decades by researchers genuinely trying to solve the mystery. Atmospheric refraction, piezoelectric discharges from quartz-bearing rocks under tectonic stress, swamp gas ignition in the desert air, ball lighting, earthquake lights, and various rare atmospheric phenomena. Each theory has its proponents among the scientific community and its fundamental problems that keep it from being accepted as a definitive answer. The most prosaic explanation suggests the lights are nothing more than car headlights on distant highways, reflecting and distorted by atmospheric conditions. This idea fails to account for sightings that predate the automobile by decades, documented observations from the 1880s and 1890s. It fails to explain observations of behavior no vehicle could replicate, the vertical climbs at impossible speeds, the instantaneous color changes from orange to red to white, the ability to split apart and merge back together. The truth is we simply don't know what the Marfa Lights are, and perhaps that uncertainty is valuable in an age that assumes every mystery can be solved with sufficient data and computational power. The lights remind us that the world still contains genuine mysteries, phenomena that resist explanation and refuse to be domesticated by scientific theory or technological analysis. They've been witnessed by thousands of people over more than a century, documented in countless photographs and videos, and studied by researchers with sophisticated equipment and university credentials. Yet they remain as enigmatic today as they were when the first cowboys saw them from horseback in the 1880s. That persistence itself is remarkable, the kind of stubborn resistance to their relentless categorization and explanation that defines the modern scientific worldview. These aren't folklore or campfire tall tales, but documented phenomena seen by credible witnesses who had nothing to gain from lying and everything to lose from being labeled crazy. West Texas is a landscape that encourages such mysteries that seem to be designed to hold secrets. The vast distances and empty spaces create a sense of possibility that crowded urban environments simply can't match. The air is clear enough that stars blaze with an intensity that city dwellers have forgotten is possible, painting the sky with thousands of points of light. The darkness between human settlements is deep and genuine, unbroken by street lights or billboards, or the ambient glow of civilization. This is a country where the horizon seems impossibly distant, where you can see weather systems developing hours before they arrive, where the sheer scale of land reduces human presence to insignificance. It makes our towns and ranches seem like temporary intrusions on something eternal. In such a place, unexplained lights dancing across the desert seem less like violations of natural law and more like reminders that we understand far less about the universe than we sometimes pretend to. The stories in this collection honor the mystery rather than attempting to solve it or explain it away with easy answers. Each narrative is independent, complete in itself, a self-contained encounter with the unknown, but together they suggest the persistence of consistency of the phenomenon across time and different types of witnesses, cowboys and soldiers, prospectors and surveyors, men with different eras and different backgrounds. They all saw essentially the same thing when they were encountering the lights, objects or phenomena that move with intelligence and purpose, that perform maneuvers no natural occurrence could explain, yet remain utterly inexplicable. Their testimony spans generations and social classes, comes from people whose reliability and sanity in other matters were never questioned by those who knew them. It describes experiences that fundamentally changed how these men understood the world, that gave them a sense of mystery they carried for the rest of their lives. As you drift toward sleep, consider those countless witnesses standing under the West Texas sky for more than a century, watching lights perform their mysterious ballet across the empty desert. Consider the patience of the land itself, ancient and weathered, the way it holds secrets close and guards them jealously, the way it offers them only to those willing to watch and wonder in the darkness, without demanding immediate explanation or scientific proof of rational answers. The Marfa Lights are there tonight, out on the Mitchell Flat and in the desert beyond, just as they've been there for more than a century of documented sightings, just as they'll likely be there long after we're all gone and forgotten. long after our cities have crumbled and our technologies have failed, dancing across the flatlands with purpose we can't fathom and origins we can't trace, performing for an audience that may be no one at all. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, to resist our attempts to categorize and explain and reduce them to data points. Some phenomena exist to remind us that rationally and scientific method, for all their tremendous value, don't exhaust the full range of human experience or cosmic possibility. The Marfa Lights don't care whether we believe in them or dismiss them as optical illusions. They don't care whether we understand them or explain them, or photograph them with increasingly sophisticated equipment. They simply are as permanent and indifferent as the mountains that ring the desert, as much a part of West Texas as the wind that never stops blowing and the dust that coats everything it touches. And in their presence, and in their stubborn refusal to be explained away or dismissed as folklore, they offer something increasingly rare in the modern world: genuine wonder, authentic mystery, and the humbling recognition that we don't have all the answers, that the universe still surprises us, still holds secrets we can't unlock. Sleep well, listener, and dream of lights dancing across the high desert under a canopy of stars that stretches to infinity. Dream of cowboy witnesses who saw impossible things and carried those memories until their dying days, of prospectors who documented what they couldn't explain and filed those observations away for future generations, of trail bosses who watched their cattle spook at aerial displays that defied every law of physics they understood. Dream of mysteries that don't require solutions and that are perhaps more valuable unsolved than unexplained, of the West Texas night and the vast empty spaces that still exist between our islands of light and noise, of the possibility that some questions are more valuable than their answers, that wonder itself is worth preserving. The lights are still out there tonight, hovering over Mitchell Flat, waiting patiently for the next witness to stumble across them in the darkness, performing their ancient dance for an audience of stars and space, and anyone brave enough or foolish enough to stand in the desert and watch. They'll keep dancing long after we've all turned to dust and have been scattered by the eternal wind, carrying on their mysterious purpose in the darkness. The Marfa Lights were here before us, they'll be here after us, and maybe that's exactly how it should be.